Was this justice, or just another suburban power grab disguised as safety? Because when I refused to destroy the natural spring on my land, my HOA didn't just fine me. They triggered a disaster that would drown our lawns and nearly destroy our entire neighborhood. And not someone who looks for trouble. I'm just a father, a husband, a systems engineer living in a quiet red brick home on the edge of Cascade Heights, where lawns are trimmed to exactly 1.5 inches. The mail arrives at 3 p.m. sharp, and everyone waves, until you say no to the board. It started with a knock. My wife Sarah walked in with a letter in her shaking hands and a look I'll never forget. "You need to read this." She dropped the notice right next to our daughter's half-eaten apple pie. It read, "Oh ho notice. You have 30 days to remove the unpermitted water feature located on your property due to flood risk." Water feature? They meant the spring, my spring. The spring my grandfather built stone paths around, the one I skipped rocks on when I was 5. A natural spring that's bubbled quietly for over a century, now labeled a hazard. And if I didn't comply? $500 per day. No negotiation, no appeal, just the signature of Victoria Reed, our new HOA president, who'd called it a muddy eyesore during her first neighborhood walkthrough. I stared out the kitchen window. The willow trees swayed gently over the glistening water. Ducks paddled lazily beneath their branches. It didn't feel like a violation. It felt like someone had just declared war on everything I loved. At that moment I had no idea that by standing up for a small stream of water, I was about to uncover a massive web of corruption buried beneath perfectly manicured lawns and million-dollar smiles. This isn't just a story about water. It's about power, about community, about what happens when nature fights back. Let me show you what really happened. I was 5 years old the first time I touched that water. It was late spring, and my grandfather, who always smelled faintly of pipe smoke and cedar, led me down a narrow, winding path through the willows behind our house. "This," he said, crouching beside a pool that shimmered like glass, "is your inheritance. It doesn't look like much now, but it's older than every roof in this neighborhood." He dipped his hand in the cold stream. I remember how his fingers looked almost translucent beneath the surface. "This spring kept our family going during the Dust Bowl, kept the cattle watered, kept your great-grandmother sane. You protect this, son, and it'll protect you." I didn't fully understand what he meant then, but I do now. Because what Victoria Reed saw as a muddy puddle was to me a living memory, etched into the soil, into the stones he placed there himself, one by one. Every curve of that spring bore his signature. Every patch of moss along its edge whispered his story. When I got older, I learned more. That spring wasn't just sentimental. It was essential. It regulated the groundwater across our lot. On scorching summer days, it cooled the back half of the property by nearly 10 degrees. The ducks that nested there controlled mosquito populations better than any spray the HOA ever used. It was nature's quiet equilibrium, humming just below our feet. But of course, no balance stays undisturbed forever. When Cascade Heights expanded in the early 2000s, they paved over runoff channels, built homes on compacted soil, redirected natural creeks underground. Still, the spring remained. It flowed. It adapted. And it reminded me, day after day, that we weren't the first to walk this land, and we wouldn't be the last. I once read about an old woman in New Mexico who fought off a real estate developer to preserve a small desert well her ancestors had relied on for generations. When asked why, she said, "Because land remembers." I didn't fully grasp it until now. My spring wasn't just water. It was memory. It was function. It was resistance. But try explaining that to a boardroom full of realtors in pastel polos. To them, that spring was a liability, an unmonetized patch of mud, an obstacle standing between them and a future cul-de-sac expansion, or maybe a new pool club, who knows. They didn't care that birds nested in the willows each spring. They didn't care that the neighborhood's temperature was lower near our lot. They didn't care that during the drought of '78, the entire block relied on this very water when the city lines failed, because the only legacy they respected was equity. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about saving a spring. It was about saving the idea that not everything valuable can be appraised. So I did what any desperate man would do. I dug, literally and figuratively. I unearthed old survey maps, soil reports, temperature logs. I tracked wildlife. I recorded temperature shifts across my backyard versus the neighbors. I built a binder thicker than Victoria's makeup kit. But more importantly, I started asking questions. Uncomfortable ones. And what I found would shake this neighborhood to its core. Because when you start pulling on the roots of a lie, especially one as profitable as a flood mitigation plan, you're bound to uncover things that weren't meant to see daylight. And as I would soon find out, Victoria Reed wasn't just trying to kill my spring. She was building an empire. One favor, one vote, one silence at a time. And she didn't plan to let anyone get in her way. Not even me. The first time I met Victoria Reed, she smiled like a woman who already knew she'd won. It was during the annual Cascade Heights Block Barbecue, the kind where HOA board members hand out free lemonade while quietly sizing up your lawn's edgework. She floated across the street in a coral dress, heels that somehow didn't sink into the grass, and a clipboard tucked under one arm like a royal decree. "Hi, I'm Victoria," she said, her handshake soft but decisive. "I'm here to elevate this neighborhood." I didn't realize then that elevate meant control. Within weeks, Victoria had installed herself as HOA president unopposed. No one else wanted the job. No one questioned how the rules were suddenly shifting, subtly but steadily. Landscaping standards became stricter, driveway inspections increased, pet noise complaints tripled overnight. And always, always there was the clipboard. She ruled through paper, violations, fines, newsletters worded like ultimatums. But what made her truly dangerous wasn't just her ability to weaponize bureaucracy. It was how easily people gave in. I watched it happen in real time. Martha, my next-door neighbor, used to stop by with banana bread and stories about her grandkids. Now she avoided eye contact. I later found out Victoria had promised her fast-tracked approval for a second-floor guest suite, if she'd support the spring removal. Brian down the street got a special exemption to keep his vintage pickup parked on the curb after agreeing to vote yes on an emergency budget reallocation. Harold, the HOA treasurer, suddenly stopped answering my emails altogether. Favor by favor, silence by silence, Victoria built her empire. And if you weren't on board, you weren't just ignored. You were marked. Like me. The moment I filed my appeal to preserve the spring, I became persona non grata. My lawn was cited for inconsistent grass height. My backyard lighting was non-compliant with neighborhood ambience. And when I confronted the board about it, Victoria's smile turned colder than the spring water she was trying to drain. "Rules are rules," she said, flipping through her clipboard without looking up. But it wasn't about rules. It never was. It was about power and the illusion of fairness. You see, HOA bylaws are written in ways most homeowners never read. They're vague, flexible, open to interpretation. And Victoria was fluent in every loophole. She didn't break the system. She became the system. I started calling around, talking to lawyers. I learned that HOA boards like ours could amend rules internally with little to no homeowner input, especially if they claimed public safety or property value protection. And the kicker? Most residents wanted to believe Victoria. She was articulate, polished, reassuring. "Think of your equity," she'd say at meetings. "No one wants to live next to a swamp." And people nodded. Because in communities like ours, fear of property value drop trumps nearly everything, even history, even habitat, even truth. I felt like I was shouting underwater. Until Mr. Peterson, a retired lawyer who lived 2 blocks over, approached me after one meeting. "You're not crazy," he said, offering me a manila envelope, "but you are up against a machine." Inside were notes, financial statements, records of quiet approvals and emergency contracts. Names I recognized, some I didn't. "I tried to warn people years ago," he whispered. "But I didn't have proof. Maybe now you do." I left that meeting with a sick feeling in my gut and a fire in my chest. Because now I understood the real game Victoria was playing. This wasn't about aesthetics. This wasn't even about water. It was about silencing dissent, converting loyalty, and turning nature into profit. And the scariest part? She was just getting started. Because while the neighborhood slept, Victoria and her clipboard had plans to drain everything I held sacred before the sun could rise. It started with a sound. Not loud, not violent. Just wrong. A low, mechanical hum drifting through the night air like a mosquito with an engine. I glanced at the clock. 2:13. I am ill. Sarah stirred beside me. "You hear that?" I whispered. She didn't answer, just pulled the blanket tighter, but I was already out of bed, slipping on sweatpants, grabbing the flashlight by the window. I cracked the curtain and froze. 2 black pickup trucks idled near my fence line. Their headlights were off, but the figures moving beside them wore reflective vests. They were hauling equipment, hoses, generators, and what looked like industrial pumps. My heart kicked. I bolted down the stairs and out the back door, barefoot, breath fogging in the cold air. "Hey," I shouted, "this is private property." The men paused, startled. One stepped forward, raising a gloved hand. "Mr. Harlan, just performing an authorized drainage survey," he said. I recognized his voice. It was Marcus, the HOA's maintenance manager. At 2 in the damn morning? "It's within the board's 24-hour emergency rights, Section 14 Sublause D," he recited like a line rehearsed too many times. Then from the shadows she emerged, clipboard in hand. Victoria. Her heels crunched against the gravel as she approached, face half lit by the beam of my flashlight. "We're simply being proactive," she said smoothly. "A preemptive inspection, for safety." "There's no emergency," I snapped. "No flooding, no breach, no warning." She didn't blink. "That's the point of being proactive, Mr. Harlan. Would you prefer we wait until someone gets hurt?" She gestured toward the equipment like she was showing off a buffet. "These pumps can safely relieve excess pressure and redirect flow away from vulnerable homes." "You mean my home?" I said. She smiled then, thin, sharp, and empty. "You should go back inside. We'll be done by morning." I didn't move. Neither did she. For a long moment we just stood there, locked in silence, 2 silhouettes on opposite sides of a war nobody else knew had started, and then, without a word, she turned on her heel and disappeared into the night, her army of workers moving behind her. I stood there until they left, until the trucks rolled away, until the hum faded and the darkness returned to its stillness. But I knew they'd be back, and next time they wouldn't wait for me to wake up. The next morning I filed 3 complaints, one with the HOA, one with the county zoning office, one with the sheriff's department. None of them went anywhere. The HOA cited broad authority under emergency landscaping protocols. The county deferred to the HOA's private charter. And the sheriff's office? "Civil matter," they said. So I went online. I posted photos of the trucks, screenshots of bylaws. Even a short clip Sarah managed to film from our bedroom window, Marcus pacing with a walkie-talkie, the pumps humming behind him. The post got 5 likes. And 1 anonymous message. "Careful, she plays dirty." That night I realized something that's haunted me ever since. In a neighborhood where no one's looking, a clipboard and a contract can become weapons. Not all invasions come with sirens, some come with bylaws and bad intentions. I stayed awake the next 4 nights. Coffee, motion lights, security cams. But they didn't come back. Not yet. Instead, the damage came quietly. By Thursday, the stream's flow had weakened, the ducks stopped visiting. And the water that once trickled clear now ran cloudy. I walked the perimeter of my land and found fresh tire marks. Not from trucks. From something heavier. That's when it hit me. They'd already tapped it. While I slept, they'd installed a siphon downstream, diverting the flow before it could reach the visible basin. They were bleeding the spring dry, and by the time I could prove it, it might be too late. But what they didn't know, what even I didn't know at the time, was that draining that spring wouldn't just kill my property. It would trigger something far worse. Because that little stream, it wasn't just water. It was pressure release for the entire aquifer beneath Cascade Heights. And when you seal a pressure valve, it doesn't go quietly. It explodes. 3 days after the siphoning, my spring stopped singing. No more gentle babble across the stones. No sparkle under the willow canopy. Just a dry, cracked basin where water used to dance. I stood at its edge, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was just a dip in flow. Maybe the rain hadn't come, maybe it would return. But in my gut I knew the truth. Victoria had won round one. By the end of the week the first signs appeared. Martha's hydrangeas wilted overnight, no explanation. 2 blocks down, the Garcias posted in the neighborhood group, asking why their basement smelled like mildew. And Mr. Johnson? He woke up to 3 inches of standing water in his finished den. The HOA blamed it on poor foundation maintenance. Said it was isolated. Nothing to do with landscaping. But I knew better. Because I had a friend, and he had data. Enter Sam. Hydrologist, old college roommate. The kind of guy who could look at a puddle and tell you where the water came from, how fast it got there, and what minerals were hiding in it. When I told him what had happened, the spring, the siphoning, the sudden dampness, he went quiet. "Do you still have the old survey maps?" he asked. "I've got everything." He came that weekend. Boots, scanners, soil probes. We walked the property, measured moisture levels, checked the water table. After an hour, he closed his notebook and said 4 words I'll never forget. "You're sitting on pressure." He explained it like this. My spring wasn't just decorative. It was a natural pressure valve. The aquifer beneath Cascade Heights spanned the entire neighborhood, a shallow underground reservoir slowly feeding and relieving moisture across the landscape. That spring allowed the aquifer to breathe. Diverting it was like sealing a pot of boiling water. "You think you've stopped a leak," he said, "but really, you've just shifted the escape route." And that's exactly what was happening. The water, with nowhere to rise naturally, was forcing itself out wherever it could, through foundations, basement slabs, retaining walls. Sam pointed toward the street. "You watch," he said. "By the end of the month, you'll have sinkholes forming on Maple Drive." By week 2, 4 more houses reported flooding. The Parkinsons found mold crawling up their drywall. Bill from 2 doors down had to tear out his entire carpet. And Martha, the one who voted for the removal? I watched her from my window as she bailed water from her basement stairwell, roses floating in the runoff like forgotten promises. She caught me watching. Didn't wave. Didn't smile. Just stared. What? Angry and ashamed. That day I learned something brutal. Nature doesn't vanish when we ignore it. It reroutes, reclaims, and when we force it underground, it doesn't disappear quietly. It strikes back through drywall, through floorboards, through everything we thought we had under control. The HOA tried to bury it. They said the Johnsons had faulty pipes. The Garcias must have overwatered their garden. But then the community pool cracked. Not a little fissure. A full structural breach. Water shot up from beneath the deep end like a geyser. Concrete buckled, the surface split open, a chunk of the deck collapsed into a crater of wet earth. And suddenly the silence was gone. People were talking, panicking, and for the first time, listening. Because once the leaks started, real and metaphorical, so did the questions. Who ordered the siphon? Who approved the midnight survey? And why had Victoria's drainage contractor just won a $2 million 0-cents repair contract for the very problems they caused? The answers? They weren't just about water anymore. They were about money, and secrets, and a cover-up so deep, it went all the way to the boardroom. Follow the money. That's what Mr. Peterson, our retired neighborhood lawyer, whispered to me one morning as we stood watching a backhoe tear up a section of Martha's flooded lawn. At that point, 5 homes had water damage. The community pool was cordoned off with yellow tape. And yet, Victoria Reed, she was still smiling, still sending out HOA emails about stormwater resilience and long-term infrastructure planning like she was the town's savior, not the arsonist in a fireproof dress. Peterson handed me a flash drive. "I've been digging through HOA records," he said. "You should see this." That night, I plugged it in, and what I found made my stomach twist. $2,134,000.00. That was the value of the emergency drainage contract, awarded 3 weeks after the spring was siphoned. The recipient? Cascade Drainage Solutions. I almost didn't catch it, but something about the name rang a bell, so I searched the owner's name, Daniel Keller. My heart dropped. Daniel Keller was Victoria's brother-in-law, a man who just 2 years earlier had his geological surveyor's surveys license suspended for falsifying reports on unstable land near a school development project. And now he was the lead contractor, hand-picked, no bidding process, no resident vote, on a multi-million-dollar repair job to fix a flood he helped create. The pieces clicked like a bad crime novel. Victoria had fabricated a flood risk, used her HOA authority to declare an emergency, hired her brother-in-law's company to solve the very problem they manufactured, then pushed the costs onto homeowners as part of urgent budget reallocations. It was a scam, elegant, legal-looking, and devastating. And she might have gotten away with it if the aquifer hadn't started exploding through basement walls. I wasn't the only one noticing the pattern. Bill from 2 doors down, he found invoice discrepancies. The Garcias found an email thread where Victoria personally approved over $200,000, in expedited pumping services without board consultation. And Martha? Martha came to my door one rainy afternoon, mascara streaked from tears and frustration. "I checked my emails," she said, holding up her phone. "She promised me fast-track approvals for my renovation if I supported the drainage motion." She looked sick. I didn't think it'd go this far, but it had. That's the thing about corruption. It rarely arrives in black ski mask. It comes with handshakes, smiles, promises of discounts and upgrades. And if you're not paying attention, you become part of it. I created a website, posted everything, financial records, contractor connections, Martha's emails, legal history on Daniel Keller. Then I shared it in the neighborhood Facebook group with one line: "How many basements need to flood before we start asking who's cashing in?" By the next day, the post had over 300 comments. Some people defended Victoria, said she was just doing her best. Others, they demanded a recall vote. And still others quietly messaged me with their own receipts, their own screenshots, their own regrets. The tide was turning, but Victoria wasn't going down without a fight. She hired a PR firm, released a community bulletin accusing me of defamation and misinformation, claimed my rumors were jeopardizing property values. She even sent me a cease and desist letter. It arrived the same day my motion detector camera caught Marcus, the HOA maintenance manager, tampering with my water meter at midnight. And that's when I knew. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about cover-up, and they were running scared. But you can't bury the truth forever, especially not in wet ground. Because just when it felt like we were shouting into the void, something unexpected happened. A voice from the past broke through the noise. One post, one memory, and it turned the entire neighborhood against her. The post didn't come from me. It came from Mrs. Henderson, 84 years old. Lived in Cascade Heights since before it had a name. Most folks assumed she'd retired from public life, content to tend her flower beds and feed birds from her porch swing. But that morning she typed out a memory that hit harder than any exposé I'd written. In the drought of 1978, the city water went dry for 6 days. The only reason we had anything to drink was that spring. We filled jugs, buckets, even kiddie pools. That spring didn't just look pretty, it kept us alive. Then she attached a photo. Grainy, faded. Dozens of neighbors lined up with metal pots and plastic milk jugs beside my spring. Children barefoot, elderly with handkerchiefs around their necks. People I recognized years younger, faces I'd passed in the grocery store. Suddenly the story wasn't about me anymore. It was about us. Within hours her post exploded. Comments flooded in, stories from people who'd grown up here. I remember catching frogs in that water. My mom said we used it to rinse off after the blackout. Wait, that's the same spring Victoria had drained? Even folks who'd kept quiet began speaking up. Mr. Collins, HOA vice president, admitted he'd voted yes under pressure. He posted anonymously at first, then publicly. We were told it was a liability. We were not told it was our emergency water supply in '78. 3 board members resigned within the week. Victoria tried to salvage the narrative. She released an official statement. The HOA made the best decision with the information available at the time. But now we had better information. Older, stronger, and far more human than a clipboard full of fines. Something had changed. You could feel it in the way neighbors waved again. The way people leaned over fences to whisper, "I saw what you posted, thank you." For the first time there was unity in our fear, in our anger, and in our regret. We weren't just worried about wet carpet anymore. We were mourning what we'd allowed to be destroyed. Because that's what memory does. It anchors us. It reminds us that not everything worth keeping comes with a price tag. That some things, like a spring that saves lives, matter not because of what they cost, but because of who they've carried. We forgot that. Victoria counted on us forgetting that. But Mrs. Henderson didn't. And sometimes all it takes is one voice, one story to bring everything back into focus. People began to act. A petition circulated demanding a full forensic audit of HOA finances. Local news picked up the story. Drained spring that saved community during historic drought. Environmental activists weighed in, calling it an intentional ecosystem disruption. The pressure mounted. Victoria canceled the next HOA meeting due to security concerns, then reinstated it 48 hours later after an emergency vote forced her hand. That night the school auditorium was packed wall to wall. And this time I wasn't the only one with evidence. Dozens came forward, emails, text threads, meeting notes scribbled on napkins. But nothing hit harder than what came next. Sarah stood up, holding her phone. She hit play. And from the speaker came Victoria's own voice, recorded months earlier on the day they siphoned the spring. Once property values dip, my developer friends will sweep in, cheap land, clean slate. We'll all make millions. Gasps. Shouts. Someone stood up and screamed, "You endangered my family for a real estate flip?" Even the HOA loyalists, what few remained, went pale. Victoria tried to speak. But for once no one listened. Because when a community remembers what it once survived together, there's no room for dictators with designer handbags. That night, everything changed. We filed the lawsuit the next morning. Not just me, we. 22 homeowners. Flooded basements. Destroyed memories. Shattered trust. And Victoria Reed? She was finally about to face a courtroom that cared far less about HOA codes and far more about the truth. It was a crisp Thursday morning when we filed the lawsuit. I remember the chill, not just from the air, but from the weight of what we were doing. 22 names on that document, 22 families who had finally had enough. Flooded basements, ruined photographs, cracked foundations, and one spring, now dry and crumbling, that had once quietly held us all together. The county clerk raised her eyebrows when she saw the plaintiff list. "OA case?" she asked, sliding the file toward a basket labeled Urgent Civil Disputes. "No," I said, "environmental fraud." The media had already picked up the scent. By noon, the headline was plastered across local news stations. Community sues HOA over illegal spring drainage, corruption allegations mount. Victoria didn't respond at first. No press conference? No statement. Just silence, and one carefully worded email to all residents claiming the suit was meritless and politically motivated. But we had receipts. Emails, financial records, a voice recording of her planning the land flip. Even testimony from former board members and HOA employees. And when we finally got a court date, the suburbs paid attention. The courthouse was packed. Not with reporters or lawyers, but with neighbors. People from every corner of Cascade Heights, some angry, some ashamed, most just stunned. Victoria walked in like she still owned the room. Designer suit, sunglasses, clipboard tucked under her arm like a badge of invincibility. But it didn't take long for the cracks to show. The prosecution started with the geological report. "Can you confirm," the attorney asked, "that this survey was conducted by your brother-in-law?" Victoria hesitated. "He's a certified contractor." The prosecutor nodded. "Was. His license was suspended in 2021. Did you disclose that to the board?" No answer. Then came the financial statements. Inflated invoices, duplicate charges. A $2,100,000 0-cents contract to Cascade Drainage Solutions, awarded without competitive bidding, without community vote. Victoria claimed it was emergency work. "So, you bypassed protocol to hire a family member with a revoked license to destroy a 100-year-old natural spring?" The room went silent. Even the judge raised an eyebrow. Then came our turn. Sarah took the stand. She played the recording, the one where Victoria bragged about dropping property values to bait developers. The courtroom speakers crackled with her voice. "Once prices dip, we'll buy the block, clean it up, flip it, make millions." A gasp rippled through the room. Then Mrs. Henderson stepped up, slow, shaking but determined. She told the court about 1978, about how the spring kept the neighborhood alive during the drought, how she'd watched Victoria drain it in the name of safety and knew in her bones that something was wrong. And then came Sam, the hydrologist. Charts, maps, water table readings. He explained how the spring acted as a pressure release valve, how its destruction triggered a chain reaction, floods, foundation failures, infrastructure damage. By the end of his testimony, even the jury looked rattled. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't always roar in. Sometimes it creeps, builds, pools beneath the surface until the dam breaks. And when it does, no amount of HOA bylaws can stop it from flooding the courtroom. Victoria's defense unraveled quickly. She accused me of leading a witch hunt, claimed I had manipulated community sentiment for personal vendetta. But the evidence didn't lie, and neither did the mold growing in half the basements on our street. The judge ruled in our favor. Victoria was ordered to pay restitution from personal assets. Cascade Drainage Solutions lost its license. The HOA board was dissolved pending state audit. And Victoria? She was arrested before she left the courtroom on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and environmental tampering. The look on her face wasn't anger. It was disbelief, as if she'd truly believed she'd never get caught. But lawsuits don't fix drywall. They don't erase mold or bring back a vanished spring. That would take something more, something deeper than court orders, something older than bylaws. It would take a community coming together again, to rebuild, to heal, and maybe to begin again. Legal victory feels good for about a day. After the trial, people shook my hand at the grocery store. Neighbors who once ignored me waved again, and Sarah's recording of Victoria hit 2.4 million views online. The headline on the local news read, "HOA President Convicted, Justice Served in Cascade Heights." But headlines don't stop water from seeping through your walls, and justice doesn't dry out the black mold in your crawlspace. The next morning I walked down my basement steps and stared at the water line still visible on the wall, 17 inches up. The truth hit me like a cold slap. We may have won the war, but we were still drowning in the wreckage. It wasn't just my home. The Garcias had to rip out their hardwood floors. The Johnsons filed for bankruptcy after their foundation estimate came back at $63,000. And Martha, whose roses once curled around perfect white lattice, now spent her days hauling sodden furniture into a rented dumpster. We needed more than apologies. We needed a way forward. That's when the idea hit me. What if we rebuilt this place, not just physically, but fundamentally? No more secrecy, no more boardroom backdoor. What if we turned the site of destruction into the start of something better? I called Sam. We sat under what was left of the willow trees, mapping out the old aquifer channels by flashlight and memory. If we open the spring again, I asked, can we reverse the pressure shifts? He nodded slowly. Not instantly, but if we restore it properly and give it time, it might just rebalance. But we couldn't do it alone. So we called a meeting. Not in a stuffy HOA clubhouse, but right there at the edge of the spring. People brought folding chairs, blankets, hot cocoa and thermoses. Some even brought tools. And we talked. No suits, no microphones, just voices. Real voices. Tired, angry, hopeful. We formed a new neighborhood group, not an HOA but a cooperative trust. Elected transparently, open books. Every decision required majority input. We applied for state grants, environmental aid. And when that wasn't enough, we rolled up our sleeves. Bill volunteered to install French drains. The teenagers down the block ran soil tests. Mrs. Henderson's granddaughter designed flyers for our new water stewardship campaign. Even Martha, yes, that Martha, planted a rain garden to help filter runoff naturally. She smiled as she watered it and said, "Maybe this is how we make things right." Rebirth doesn't start with blueprints. It starts with belief. Belief that the damage isn't permanent. That the cracks in our homes aren't as wide as the cracks in our trust, and that both can heal. Because when people stop waiting for someone else to fix things, they become the fix. By fall, something incredible happened. The spring returned. First, just a trickle. Then a pool, then a gentle, persistent flow, clear as memory and just as sacred. The ducks came back. The willow branches stopped drooping. And so did we. The community wasn't just recovering. It was transforming. We hosted our first spring festival that October. Kids played in the shallows. Local musicians performed beside hand-painted murals of our neighborhood story. There was laughter, real laughter. And for the first time in a long time, I saw people looking at the spring with something beyond relief. They looked at it with respect. It wasn't just about drainage or damage anymore. It was about what the spring had always been trying to tell us, beneath the noise, beneath the politics. That some things are worth protecting. That truth finds its way, like water. And that healing starts where the damage ran deepest. But to understand the full lesson, we had to listen. And we had to remember, it started with a spring. It ended with a movement. 1 year after the lawsuit, I stood knee-deep in the shallow edge of the stream, helping a group of 6th graders from the local school identify native plants. They laughed when one of them slipped and fell in, soaking her jeans. I smiled and offered a towel. Behind us, the willow trees had grown thicker, greener. The ducks had returned for good. And nearby, the Cascade Heights Environmental Education Center, built from the shell of Victoria Reed's seized mansion, stood as a quiet monument to everything we nearly lost. In a glass case inside the lobby, we kept reminders. A rusted pipe from the illegal drainage system. A chunk of cracked concrete from the collapsed community pool. A photo of the spring in 1978, surrounded by neighbors holding buckets during the drought. And next to it, in bold letters, this spring didn't just hold water, it held memory, it held warning. It held us. When the state inspector returned for the final aquifer evaluation, she shook her head and said something that stuck with me. You turned a man-made disaster into a model for environmental resilience. It wasn't easy. It took 12 months, 46 volunteers, 3 emergency repairs and a federal grant. But the aquifer had stabilized. The groundwater had leveled. The lawsuits had settled, and the silence that once followed every HOA meeting had been replaced by voices, dozens of them, speaking openly, asking questions, challenging authority. We've changed. And maybe that was the real victory. Water has a way of teaching, quietly, persistently, patiently. It flows around obstacles. It seeps through silence. It remembers where it once was and fights to return. And maybe we should do the same. Because the damage didn't come just from one bad leader. It came from us, from our willingness to look away, to trust too easily, to prioritize property value over principle. But the healing? That came from listening, from remembering, from standing together when it would have been easier to stay silent. I still think about Victoria sometimes. Last I heard, she moved out of state. No HOA, no clipboard, just gone. Sometimes I wonder if she ever understood what she destroyed. Not just the spring, but the trust, the unity, the history. But then again, maybe she gave us something too. Not by intention, but by consequence. She showed us what happens when power goes unchecked. What it costs to ignore the natural systems that quietly sustain us. And what we can become when we stop being afraid to speak. Now, every time I walk past the spring, I see kids splashing, teenagers skipping stones, grandparents telling stories about the old neighborhood. We even renamed the walking path that runs along the edge. Resilience Trail. Because that's what this story became. Not a cautionary tale. Not a victory lap. But a reminder that nature always speaks, and we'd better learn to listen. On quiet mornings, I sit on the old wooden bench under the willow and just listen. To the water, to the birds, to the soft laughter of a community that nearly forgot who it was and found its voice just in time. They say water always finds a way. So does truth. So does justice. And now, because we dared to remember, so do we.